Welcome everyone to Congregation Emmanuel's. This is our bi-monthly Lunch and Learn series on Israel and the Middle East. And today we are fortunate to have with us Dr. Danielle Farah. Daniela is a 2021-23 Samuel W. and Goldie Marion Spain postdoctoral fellow in Jewish studies at Rice University. She received her PhD in Jewish history from Stanford University in summer 2021. Dr. Farah's scholarship, which lies at the intersection of Jewish history, Middle Eastern history, education history, and transnational studies, examines interreligious encounters, national belonging, and Jewish identity formation in modern Iran and Turkey. She has been awarded several national grants and awards, including a Salo Baron New Voices in Jewish Studies Award and a Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture grant. As an Iranian American Jewish woman, her work aims to give voice to Middle Eastern Jews' experience. We are delighted to have Dr. Farah with us here today and also as a member of our congregation. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Well, before I start my presentation, I want to say thank you for all of you who were able to attend and also the staff at Temple Emmanuel for making this possible. I really look forward to sharing my work with you all and hearing your questions at the very end. So let me just get the presentation itself started. Bear with me. Let's see. Great. Okay, just let me know, by the way, Stefani, if there are any issues with the presentation. Okay, so my talk today is called Jews in 20th Century Iran, National Belonging, Education, and Identity. And I recognize that many of you probably have very little knowledge, understandably, about modern Iranian history and the Jews of Iran more specifically, but I hope through this talk I can give some contextual information as we go along. So I'm hoping it won't be too academic of a talk. I want it to be approachable to people who are not as familiar with this history. So the talk will explore 20th century Iranian Jewish history and identity through several key themes. First, migration, upward mobility, Jewish-Muslim interactions, and the intersection of education and integration. I'll be examining the years 1945 to 1979 mostly, and that coincides with the reign of Mohammad Reza Shah, who was the second king of the Pahlavi dynasty. He came into power after his father was deposed in 1941. And so, this period is very interesting for a number of reasons, but when it comes to the Jews of Iran, it's an era in which Jews undeniably experienced massive upward mobility and integrated into many facets of Iranian society. So this is why I focus on this period in my research, but I am also interested, in case you're curious, in looking at what happened to the Jews of Iran post-1979, and I'd be happy to talk a bit about that in the Q&A. So I'm going to start now by giving a brief history brief background on the history of Iranian Jews in the mid-20th century, where this story begins. So Habib Levy, an Iranian Jewish scholar born in Tehran in 1896, posits in his book, A Comprehensive History of the Jews of Iran, the common diasporic Iranian Jewish narrative that life under the Pahlavis, especially under Mohammad Reza Shah, was like paradise for the Jews. Other scholars and non-scholars alike often, really agree with this claim by stating that Jews gained growing liberties under the rule of the Pahlavis. And actually, I don't know if any of you know Iranian Jews. There are not many in Houston, but if you speak to many Iranian Jews in the US, especially those who were born and raised in Iran, they often attribute the improvements in the status of the Jews directly to the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah. So under Mohammad Reza Shah's rule, Jews did become prominent in commerce, the medical and pharmaceutical fields, and were overrepresented in universities. Jews operated their own schools, synagogues, newspapers, philanthropies, and youth clubs. Engagement in a diverse array of professions and activities brought Jews into contact with the larger non-Jewish world and reinforced their rootedness in the social, cultural, and economic facets of Iranian life. And when I talk about this issue of rootedness, it's actually one that's really important when we examine Iranian Jewish identity. In both the archival research I've done and in my interviews with Iranian Jews, oftentimes they will really emphasize the fact that Jews had been living in Iran for over 2,500 years as a way to really show their embeddedness in the Iranian soil and be able to claim, we were here before Islam came to Iran. And so it's kind of this device that a lot of Iranian Jews use to prove their loyalty and to prove their Iranianness. But I'll get back to that later. So I think the slide is acting up a little bit. Okay, there we go. Before I explore the years 1945 to 1979, I'm just very briefly going to discuss the Constitutional Revolution of 1906 to 1911, because this was when the Jews of Iran were first legally emancipated. So at this time, at the turn of the 20th century, there were around 40,000 Jews in Iran. This revolution led to the creation of the first constitution and the convening of the first parliament. But several edicts from this period directly impacted the recognized religious minorities, which is a group that includes Jews, Zoroastrians, and Christians, but importantly not Baha'is, because Shia Islam views the Baha'i faith as heretical, and that's still an issue in Iran today. So as far as the changes that happened, one was that there was an edict that basically revoked the poll tax, which was a specific tax in Farsi called jizya that recognized religious minorities had to pay in order to show their deference to Islam and receive protection and reward for that. So that was revoked, and that had been enforced for hundreds and hundreds of years. Another change that came was that these religious minorities were declared legal equals to Muslims, and they were allowed to elect a member to parliament to represent their interests. But historian Danielle Farah cautions that although the revolution improved the legal status of Jews, Zoroastrians, and Christians to a certain extent, a number of restrictions remain in place. So, for example, a 1907 law dictated that only a Muslim could become minister. So Sadiq concludes, and I would agree with this, that these religious minorities didn't actually become legal equals to Muslims in practice. In their own reflections on the impacts of the constitutional movement, Iranian Jews highlighted both improvements in their quality of life and the restrictions they continued to face after their emancipation. A 1927 letter written by several Iranian Jews to the League of Nations is an excellent example of this. In this letter, a few Iranian Jews wrote that despite being declared legal equals to Muslims, Jews were still deprived of many civil rights. So they noted, for example, that at that time in 1927, Jews were barred from working in certain sectors of the government, such as the Ministries of Interior and Foreign Affairs. Jewish Iranian accounts from later decades echoed similar sentiments. A 1946 article in the Iranian Jewish newspaper Israel, which I'll return to later, is a good example of this. Its author wrote that although after the revolution, Jews were able to enter certain professions that had once been out of reach to them, they still faced discrimination in various professional and societal fields, quote, merely because we are Jewish, end quote. So in sum, although Jews were afforded representation in parliament and had increased access to some civil rights after their emancipation, these rights remained somewhat limited in scope, and some discrimination persisted. But I really want to emphasize that this interplay of discrimination and increased civil rights is not unique to the Iranian Jewish experience of emancipation. In fact, if you look at a lot of countries in Europe, like France and other Central European countries who experienced emancipation, we see the same patterns repeating themselves. It just, the major difference is that Jews were emancipated a lot later than many of the Jews in Western and Central Europe. So now I'll talk a bit briefly about demography. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Jews lived in every corner of Iran. They were spread out over nearly 30 cities, towns, and villages. And I'll just point to this map here to give you a sense. From the Kurdish region of Sanandaj in the northwest to Mashhad in the northeast, from Tehran in the north to Shiraz in the south, and also in many other cities. At their height in the late 1940s, there were around 100,000 Jews living in Iran. Nearly 22,000 of those Jews immigrated to Israel between 1948 and 1952. By the early 1950s, the number of Jews in Iran ranged from 70 to 82,000, and that number would remain more or less the same until the 1970s. So now I'm going to look at urban migration and immigration to Israel in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Following the end of the Second World War, there was massive internal migration in Iran from the villages to urban areas. And so Jews and non-Jews alike left the provinces in droves, with Jews moving either to Tehran or Israel. An indication of the heavy urbanization is that in the mid-1940s, only around 25% of the Jews were living in Tehran, but by 1970, 75% of Jews were living in Tehran. Jews from the provinces were motivated to move to the big city for a number of reasons, but the two main ones was that they believed the capital would offer them more financial opportunities and a more tolerant environment, and they found this to be true. So the majority of the 22,000 Iranian Jews who immigrated to Israel in the first few years after its establishment were impoverished. These were the poorest of the poor. Upon their arrival in Israel, the government placed most Iranian Jews in immigrant absorption camps known as Mabarot. Residents there expressed that they encountered overcrowding, deficient sanitary and hygiene conditions, and uneven access to medical care. But what I found was that compounding these health concerns was the discrimination that Mizrahi Jews faced. And when I say Mizrahi, I'm referring to Jews from Muslim-majority countries. So as historian Orit Bashkin notes, Iraqi residents of these camps argued that the Ashkenazi camp directors gave preference to the Ashkenazi Jews when it came to job and housing placements. So as a result of the poor living conditions and discrimination they faced, many Iranian Jews began writing family members in Iran shortly after their arrival, discouraging them from moving to Israel. So I came across a lot of these instances of letters where families who had just moved from Iran to Israel would write back to their families in Iran saying, don't come here, the situation is not great. And of course, we need to remember that these were the early years of Israel's state. So, they were still figuring things out. But furthermore, in 1951, Israel updated who was eligible for immigration. They had something called the seleksia, and this determined who was eligible for immigration to Israel among the Iranian Jews. And what they dictated was that only those who were young, healthy, and educated could immigrate, which barred many of the potential Iranian candidates from moving to Israel. And I actually came across a number of instances in my archival research describing how many Jews from the provinces had, sold all of their goods and property, then came to Tehran in the hopes of boarding a plane or ship to Israel. But when they arrived, they were told that they were not deemed fit to immigrate to Israel. And this was, of course, very devastating for those Jews. But another added layer that's really interesting is that thousands of Iranian Jews who had made Aliyah, which means who had immigrated to Israel, chose to move back to Iran, warning that all lucrative work was reserved for Ashkenazis. And if you're familiar with Middle Eastern Jewish history, this is actually very remarkable because many Jews who moved from other Muslim majority countries, such as, for example, Iraq or Egypt, they could not go back to their countries of origin. But Iran was still a place that was welcome to Jews. And in fact, Iran and Israel had, a decent relationship during this time. So it was actually possible to go back to Iran, whereas it wasn't for many Jews who left parts of the Middle East and North Africa. So this is, I think, one really interesting element that distinguishes Iranian Jewish history from the history of Jews in other Muslim majority countries. So immigration to Israel picked up a little bit toward the end of the 1950s, but at a sharply reduced rate. For example, an Alliance Israélite Universelle official argued in 1959, and I'll return to this organization because they're very important. Quote, "It seems that a very clear majority of Iranian Jews do not at all consider the possibility of emigration. On the contrary, everything indicates the strongest and most sincere attachment to the soil, a nation, a culture, its institutions, all things with which such a long past has forged particularly strong links." The reasons for the lower rates of immigration in the late 1950s and early 1960s were manifold. First, as I'll discuss next, in the 1950s, Iranian Jews were beginning to achieve upward mobility and were attending universities in large numbers. So moving to Israel would therefore mean a loss of livelihood, especially because it meant learning a new language. And actually something I came across that was really interesting was that unlike the Jews from Arabic-speaking countries, which had familiarity with Arabic, as you know, Arabic and Hebrew are both Semitic languages, so they found it a lot easier to learn Hebrew. But Persian, Farsi, the language that's spoken in Iran, is an Indo-European language. So it was kind of harder for Persian Jews to learn Hebrew than it was for Jews from Arabic-speaking countries. So on top of that, I was talking about how there were Jews who were moving back from Israel to Iran, right? This trend continued into the 1960s. And the Iranian Jews who moved back spoke of their difficulties acclimating to Israeli life, further convincing other Jews not to move to Israel. But lastly, as this quote here indicates, the Iranian Jews who remained in Iran didn't want to leave because they had formed really strong bonds with the nation. But of course, I don't want to give the impression that Iranian Jews were anti-Israel. This is not the case whatsoever. There were some who were, but what I'm trying to say basically is that the major point I'm trying to make is that it's important to note that the majority of Jews did decide to stay in Iran until 1979. But there were strong connections between Iran and Israel, and Jews in Iran would often go to Israel to visit family members, including my own family members. Jews in Israel who were originally from Iran would go back to Iran to visit family members. So there really was a cultivation of a strong attachment to Israel as well. But again, the point I'm making is that it's remarkable that most Iranian Jews chose to remain in Iran. Okay, so now I'm going to move to economic status and upward mobility. I'm just going to take a sip of water. All right, so throughout the first half of the 20th century, Iran's Jews, like the majority of the Iranian nation, were desperately poor. The main professions of Jews by 1945 were as peddlers, cloth sellers, grocers, refuse collectors, and petty merchants. A select few were doctors, government employees, and wealthy industrialists, but they remained in the few at this time. However, Jews did begin to experience unprecedented upward mobility in the 1950s, and there are many reasons for this, but I'm just going to focus on one in particular, education. So the education offered by the Alliance Israélite Universelle in particular facilitated this upward mobility. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Alliance, I'll just give a brief background. So this is a philanthropic French Jewish organization which built schools throughout the Middle East and North Africa in the 1860s and onward. And they aimed to help defend Jews wherever they were persecuted, and they worked to bring about the emancipation of unemancipated Jews, mostly in Muslim majority countries. Because the Alliance emerged within the larger, French colonialism, they problematically viewed Middle Eastern Jews as backwards and argued that they needed exposure to French education to merit their emancipation. So these schools based their curriculum on the French nationalist system, with French serving as the main language of instruction. They taught both secular and religious studies courses. So their curriculum would include history, math, the sciences, French, as well as some Hebrew and Jewish history courses. The Alliance established its first school in Iran in 1898. And then between 1900 and 1930, as this chart here shows, it founded girls, boys, and co-ed schools in almost a dozen other cities throughout the country. So on the most basic level, acquisition of French allowed some of the graduates of Alliance schools to establish business partnerships with Europe. Moreover, according to the memoirs of Elias Seshakian, an Iranian Jew who served as teacher and director of several Alliance schools in Iran, an Alliance education helped many of its graduates enter universities in very large numbers. And of course, a university education allowed Jews to climb the socioeconomic ladder because many Jews studied in the fields of medicine, science, pharmacy, and engineering. And another example, in 1967, one of the school directors of the Alliance schools in Tehran, of the Alliance High School in Tehran, wrote that of the 700 doctors, dentists, pharmacists, and 1,000 tradesmen among the Jews in Iran at the time, quote, almost all were our former students, end quote. So these few examples, and there are many more, demonstrate that an Alliance education helps facilitate the upward mobility of a significant section of the Iranian Jewish community. But I'd argue that what perhaps is the best evidence of the Alliance's role in helping the Jews achieve upper mobility is that many of its students, boys and girls, were admitted to universities at a time when admission was highly competitive. And this was a huge issue across Iran. So I'll just give you two examples. Okay, well, first of all, in Iran, in order to get admitted to university, you have to take a university entrance exam called concours. And this exam both determines whether you will be accepted to university and also what field you'll study in. So on the 1973 to 1974 university entrance exams, 85% of those Alliance students who took the exams were admitted to universities, but only 12% of those who applied at the national level were admitted. Now, in the 1975 to 1976 school year exams, 88% of Alliance students were admitted to universities, but only 10% at the national level. But I want to add that it wasn't only Alliance graduates who were overrepresented in universities, but Jewish students on the whole. And there were also a lot of Jewish professors in Iranian universities. So something that I argue in my work, and I'll come back to this later, is that a significant presence in centers of higher education was one avenue through which Jews were able to integrate into the larger Iranian society, because in these spaces, they were able to interact daily with non-Jews. So now I'm going to conclude with this section. By the 1960s, Jews had already achieved staggering socioeconomic mobility. According to a 1965 JDC report, the Jewish, quote, community as a whole has moved up several grades on the economic ladder. The poor are less poor. The middle class, which was practically unknown, or which was practically non-existent 15 years ago, is today a substantial section of the community. And the rich is very wealthy, end quote. Another report from 1977 remarked that in Iran, quote, the number of top Jewish physicians, dentists, pharmacists, lawyers, engineers, and technicians is high, end quote. So in sum, I provided these quotes to show that within a relatively short span of time, less than 30 years, Jews went from being impoverished to largely upper middle class, with education playing a major role in this mobility. Now I'm going to turn to the theme of interreligious encounters. After the Second World War, Jews came into increasing contact with non-Jews through several arenas. So, for example, in the 1950s, as Jews were becoming wealthier, they increasingly moved out of the mahallahs, that's the term used for the Jewish quarters, and they moved to the wealthier parts of northern Tehran. In these neighborhoods, many of their neighbors were Baha'is or Zoroastrian Muslims, so many were non-Jews. And in the oral histories that I've conducted, as well as my conversations with my own family members, these Jews who were living in these nicer neighborhoods talked about how they had many non-Jewish friends and that they would often hang out at their homes. Surprisingly, military service was another area that allowed Jews and non-Jews to interact. In 1925, the newly thrown leader Reza Shah declared mandatory conscription, so Jews alongside non-Jews were required to serve in the military. According to a 1970 Allianz report, quote, "The Jews do their military service as soon as they are seen fit. Those with university degrees perform this service as officers. The Iranian army possesses a handful of officers of Jewish origin, but especially in the medical corps, supply corps, and engineering." And I just want to point out very quickly here, my own father, who is featured here, served in the army in Iran for 2 years after finishing medical school. He was stationed in a small town or small village outside of a city called Ahvaz in the southwest. As a doctor, he entered in as an officer. And, he talks a lot about that time. He says that even though he was the only Jew in his unit, and even though he was open about being Jewish, he never experienced any discrimination and he was not treated differently. In fact, the army, allowed him to travel on the weekend so he could go back home and celebrate Shabbat. So it was very interesting to hear, what was it like to be a minority within the military space. Politics was another sphere that facilitated interactions between Jews and non-Jews. For example, historian Lior Sternfeld shows that Jews were active in political movements in the 1940s and 50s through their participation in the Communist Tudeh party. So through active political engagement in which Jews collaborated with their non-Jewish compatriots, the Jews of Iran were able to integrate themselves into the larger society. And I want to pause very briefly to discuss this image here, because I think obviously photographs can speak, thousands of words. And so what you see here is a picture of students and parents rallying at the Allianz School in Kermanshah in support of the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1952, who had recently nationalized Iranian oil. I know for a fact from my archival research that in Kermanshah at this time, a large percentage of the student body was Muslim. And also, if you look at this image, you see some women and girls covering their hairs and other who are not covering their hair. And so anyways, this image then shows, it's a really beautiful, illustration of how Jews and Muslims came out together to show their support of the prime minister. So my research shows that another crucial way that Jews and non-Jews were able to interact and form meaningful relationships was through education. I found that throughout their more than 80 years in Iran, Allianz schools consistently maintain a mixed student body that included Jews and non-Jews. The Allianz actively sought the enrollment of non-Jews because their presence enhanced the prestige of the schools. It helped Jews build positive relationships with non-Jews, and it alleviated anti-Jewish discrimination. So after Reza Shah's nationalization of education, which began in the 1920s, the state also started to send non-Jewish teachers and directors to all Jewish schools. And so what ends up happening then is that in Jewish schools, Jews sat side by side Muslim, Baha'i, Christian, and Zoroastrian students, and interacted with non-Jewish staff as well. And I found that also at many of these Jewish schools, the custodial staff was Muslim. Persian language oral histories and memoirs revealed that in educational spaces, Jews formed friendships with non-Jews that extended well beyond the classroom. Jewish schools, therefore, were sites in which Jews could interact frequently and meaningfully with non-Jews. For example, one of the Iranian Jews I interviewed had attended the prestigious Etefaq school, which is featured here. This was a school that was actually founded in Tehran by Iraqi Jews, but then progressively became mostly Iranian. So I asked him about the non-Jewish student body at Etefaq, which ranged between 10 and 20% of the total population. And he responded, quote, you never got the feeling that they had any sort of prejudice against the Jews. I don't know if it was because the environment was majority Jewish, but I didn't really get that feeling. The feeling was that we're all friends and we're all equal. An important development in the 1950s was that Jewish parents began removing their children from Jewish schools and placing them in state schools because, among several reasons, they believed that attendance in Muslim majority spaces would aid their children's upward mobility. And let's keep in mind that in the 1950s, 60s, and first half of the 1970s, there wasn't this understanding that Iranian Jews would soon need to leave Iran. And in fact, a decent amount of Jews still live in Iran. At this point, they still saw their futures in Iran. And so these parents kind of had to take strategic moves. They realized that if their children were attending state schools, they'd have an easier chance of getting into prestigious universities. But at the same time as this was happening, the Jewish schools were seeing an influx of Muslim students. So the attendance of Jews in state schools and that of non-Jews in Jewish schools became so prevalent that by the early 1970s, over half of all school-aged Jewish children were attending non-Jewish schools. And even more astonishing, by 1978, more than half of all Alliance students were non-Jews. So just to hammer home this point I've been trying to make, the attendance of Jews at religiously diverse schools in Iran, both Jewish-run and state-operated, facilitated the integration of Jews into the broader Iranian society by providing them with spaces to interact frequently and meaningfully with non-Jews. Although there were still some issues that arose, and I found this through my oral histories with Iranian Jews who attended non-Jewish schools. So the last topic that I'll discuss is that of patriotism and national belonging. There were many venues through which Jews proclaimed their patriotism to Iran. One, as you can see in this image here, was through national pageantry. Another way of showing their loyalty was through the press. A May 1946 article entitled "We Are Also Iranians and We Have Rights in This Home" in the Jewish Iranian newspaper Israel argued that Jews, quote, have known themselves to be Iranian and have always fought shoulder to shoulder with the rest of their compatriots to achieve Iran's greatness, end quote. These patriotic sentiments, declarations of loyalty, and claims about the collaboration between Jews and non-Jews were standard features of Iranian Jewish newspapers in the years following World War II. I'm going to explore a couple of Jewish newspapers that were published between the mid-1940s and the early 1950s. And this was a volatile period that saw the reign of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the brief tenure of the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and his overthrow in a CIA-orchestrated coup. In these newspapers, Jews repeatedly declared their loyalty to Iran and evoked their enduring existence there to both claim membership to the nation and to demand equal rights for Iran's Jews. I argue that a strong Iranian identity allowed Jews to use the space of the press to loudly declare their loyalty and to simultaneously challenge anti-Semitism. So two of the newspapers I've examined heavily in my work are Alami Yahud, the Jewish World, and Israel. Alami Yahud was founded in May 1945, shortly after the end of World War II, and Israel was founded in April 1946. Both newspapers were written in modern Persian rather than Judeo-Persian. So Judeo-Persian was written in the Hebrew script. And therefore, because these newspapers were written in modern Persian, they were accessible to Jews and non-Jews. And in fact, I found that they had non-Jewish readers as well, because some Muslim readers would write letters to the editor, and then those newspapers would feature those letters in their newspaper. So both newspapers emerged at a critical historical moment, the first shortly after the end of World War II and the second a year later. The writers paid specific attention to Nazis and Nazi sympathizers in Iran, of which there were a few thousand. Prior to the 1941 Anglo-Soviet invasion, Nazis transmitted anti-Semitic rhetoric throughout Iran and the Middle East and North Africa through radio broadcasts. So I'll first give one example to show how Iranian Jews responded to the anti-Semitic rhetoric that certain Iranian newspapers were embracing, and then I'll discuss proclamations of loyalty. But I do want to caution here that although there were Nazi sympathizers and Nazi Germans in Iran at this time, Nazism was not a pervasive ideology in Iran, not at all. There were not many Iranians were not sympathetic to this. So this man that I've included here, for example, his name was Davoud Monshizadeh, and he was a famous Nazi propagandist. He actually had spent time in Germany in the 1930s, and that's where he was radicalized. But on the whole, research has shown that Iranians were not very sympathetic to Nazi ideology. So in a July 1946 article, Azizola Gabay denounced an author who had written, quote, "Being a Nazi is not a crime." He wrote in response, quote, "If you had the tiniest knowledge about the holy Islamic religion and had even once studied the Quran, you would see how much Islam respects the Jews." His remarks are significant because they show that Jewish writers felt comfortable entering in debates with Muslim ones. So what allowed Jewish authors to do this? I believe they felt comfortable doing so because they saw themselves to be just as Iranian as Muslims. So in other words, a strong Iranian identity emboldened Jews to dispute anti-Semitic rhetoric. In their articles, Jewish authors repeatedly emphasized their longstanding presence in Iran and their love of nation in order to claim an Iranian identity and request rights for other Jews. These writers discuss the benevolence that Iranian rulers, going back to Cyrus the Great, had ostensibly shown their Jews. So for example, in a 1945 article in Alam Yahud, the Jewish World, the author argued, first of all, that Iran's Jews were the most loyal Iranians, and then stated, quote, "The Jewish people will always remember the kindness of this affectionate mother and dear homeland Iran, and their fondness for this water and soil and for their Iranian brothers is engraved on their chests." A May 1946 article in Israel, "We are also Iranians and we have rights in this home," likewise discussed the benevolence, but as the title indicates, it also sought rights for Iran's Jews. So the author asserted that Jews view themselves singularly as Iranian, while also stressing the restrictions they were facing. However, he wrote that Iran's Jews were hopeful that the obstacles keeping them from collaborating with other Iranians would be removed. Quote, "The Jews of Iran want to unite with our dear brothers so that we may struggle shoulder to shoulder to create a new Iran." I'm going to end this section by briefly discussing an Iranian Jewish newspaper that was published in the late 1970s called Gozaresh. So like the earlier newspapers, this newspaper continued to express the Jews' attachment to Iran and their love of the nation. Gozaresh frequently referred to Jews as Mehandust, or patriots, and spoke of, quote, "the inseparable bonds between Iranian Jews and their dear Iranian compatriots," end quote. So in sum, all of the newspapers I just discussed speak to issues of national belonging and identity. The authors insisted that being Iranian was a huge part of how Jews view themselves. Okay, so I am almost done. In the short story, The Last Chapter in the Book of Exodus, the Iranian Jewish novelist Roya Hakakian discusses celebrating Passover with her family in the years before the Islamic Revolution of 1979. In one interesting passage, she writes, quote, "At Seder, we recited words that conjured no immediate bitter memories to the minds of anyone. This was the 1970s. Bondage, affliction, and suffering at the hands of a bad majority meant little to most of my family. We vowed next year in Israel, but knew even as the words rang in the air how hollow they were. The family dreamed of the land of milk and honey, but wished to wake up in Tehran." So towards the end of this story, she asks, why then, given the prosperity that her family was experiencing, why did they choose to leave Iran in 1984? What was it then that drove us out of Iran? Was it the swastika that appeared on the wall across from our door on the eve of the 1979 revolution? It terrified us, to be sure, but no acts followed, no rise in hostility among our neighbors or friends. We left Iran primarily because life under the new circumstances, war and a fundamentalist regime, was becoming gradually intolerable. We left for all the reasons that compelled anyone, whether Gentile or Jew, to leave. Academic and professional opportunities were dwindling for those who did not subscribe to the new ruling ideology. So I included these excerpts because I think they nicely encapsulate the state of Iranian Jewish life in the years preceding and following the Islamic Revolution. Many Jews felt deeply connected to the Iranian nation and an Iranian identity and saw their futures in Iran. However, with the arrival of the Islamic Revolution and the Iran-Iraq wars, life for Jews and non-Jews became increasingly unbearable, forcing many to leave. So in conclusion, I hope I was able to show in my talk that the Jews of Iran between the mid-1940s and the late 1970s were active Iranian citizens who formed close bonds with the Iranian nation and their non-Jewish compatriots. Like the Jewish experience of emancipation in many European countries, emancipation in Iran did not entail the complete abolishment of discrimination. But despite the persistence of some discrimination, Jews flourished and integrated into many facets of Iranian life and identified strongly as Iranian. Thank you.
Thank you. We did have one question come to me in the chat that said, I'm confused regarding the difference between acceptance rate between universities and national universities.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. So what I meant to say was that there were these university entrance exams that everyone in Iran who wanted to attend university had to take. And what I was talking about was I was comparing the rates of the Alliance students who were accepted to university against the national rates, so those who applied at the national level. And so what I found was that Alliance students were accepted into universities at much higher rates than the rates of the average Iranian person who was applying to university. So that was kind of my point. I hope that clarifies things.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll start now the question and answer section. Are there other questions? If you want to, I'm gonna go ahead and make it so that you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
So would you say of the countries in the Middle East that the Iranian Jews, it sounds like if you had to pick a place to live between the two world wars, that was one of the more ideal spots in terms of discrimination and upward mobility. Is that correct?
Well, that's interesting you say that. I mean, I think you were talking about the interwar era. You were saying between World War I and World War II.
Yeah, in that general area, before the state of Israel, it seemed like the Iranian Jews had it good compared to, say, the Iraqi Jews or the others. And I'm just wondering if that was
right.
True.
Okay, so it's interesting you talk about the interwar period because my research looks more at the post-war period. But I would say that if we talk about the post-war period, certainly Iran was a better place to be a Jew than other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. But also, I think what you're trying to get at was that in a lot of Muslim majority countries, there was a sympathy with Palestinians. And this starts to lead in the 1930s and early 1940s to pogroms in a lot of countries and also to like very open displays of anti-Semitism. And, you see examples of this in like Yemen and Iraq and Egypt, which they were mostly absent in Iran. But I would say that when things become like good for the Jews, and, obviously we have to complicate this idea of a golden age, but the consensus is that it was really the 1950s to the 1970s that was a period in which Jews flourished and integrated into Iranian society.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There's another
question.
And
no question. Oh yeah, I was going to say no question is stupid. So please feel free. I know that many of you are probably not familiar with Iranian history, but I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Oh, I have a question. how fast, once the Shah was deposed, did Jews start leaving Iran and going to Israel?
Mm-hmm.
And how many are left today? And at what point were the majority of them gone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And it's a very nuanced topic. First of all, I would say, to answer your question, is that actually the majority of the Jews who left Iran post Islamic Revolution, or post when the Shah was deposed, moved to the United States and to Europe. Much fewer moved to Israel. Those who did move to Israel tended to be working class. The Jews who were middle class or upper class moved to North America and Europe. And then, there was actually, it's interesting. So I don't know the exact numbers, but there was a significant group of Jews who left immediately afterwards, because there was also a guy named Habib el-Qaniyan, who was this really amazing Jewish philanthropist, and he was actually executed by the Revolutionary Guards on the claim of spying for Israel. And so I think a lot of Iranian Jews got really nervous about this, because of course, not only were they vulnerable as minorities, but they were vulnerable as minorities who had strong connections to the Shah, but also who had connections to Israel. And so this was definitely a motivating factor for many Jews leaving. But I also found in my research that actually there was a wait and see approach. So not everyone left immediately. Even into the early 1980s, I think there were around 50,000 Jews still in Iran. And they kind of just were waiting to see what would happen. There was no idea that like a Holocaust is going to happen. Like some people argued that like outside of Iran, but the Iranian Jews, they weren't worried that something that would happen, but they were worried about discrimination. But sorry, to very quickly answer your question, I found that the fear of being discriminated against was not the main motivating factor. It was rather economic mobility, because a lot of these Jews had found that after the Islamic Revolution, their opportunities dwindled. And so they saw that, and this happened to non-Jews as well. Many Muslims and other Iranians left Iran afterwards because, as I showed in that quote, like it became an unbearable place to live if you were middle class and educated. So it was a number of factors, and it didn't all happen immediately. It kind of happened more gradually. And there are today around 10 to 15,000 Jews living in Iran.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, you said that Iranian Jews faced a lot of discrimination in Israel back when like the 22,000 moved, and then Israel said only certain, only the educated, young and educated. How much discrimination do former Iranian Jews living in Israel face today? And how would you compare that with former Iranian Jews living in Europe and the United States?
That's a really interesting question. I could speak anecdotally from my own experience. I've spent a lot of time in Israel, and also from the archival sources and conversation. So half of my family is in Israel. Half of my family left Iran in 1950, 1951 and moved to Israel. And the other half moved to the US after the Islamic Revolution or around that time. So it's interesting. It's very nuanced. Like I came across a lot of instances of discrimination, kind of this understanding, because, the Israeli state was, for the most part, founded by European Zionists. And there was this prevailing understanding of Middle Eastern Jews as being backwards, as being, overly superstitious, as having very strange Jewish customs, but also as being non-Zionists. So there was this like argument that these Middle Eastern Jews are not Zionists. They're not like us, European Jews. At the same time, though, of course, in Israel, there was this melting pot ideology, right? There was this idea that we're all going to shed our past to become these new Hebrews, So a lot of Jews Hebraized their names. And this didn't only happen to the Iranians. So like an example is that my great uncle, his name was Saeed Saidi. And then he changed his name to Shraga Ezrati. But so I think there was this kind of understanding that, we are leaving behind our past to form this new, Hebrew identity. But at the same time, the Israeli society, because it was founded by Ashkenazi Jews, it tended to privilege Ashkenazi Jews when it came to a lot of social services and just various things. So there was discrimination, and I don't want to say that it was like, obviously there were good things as well. I don't want to just like paint it as a black and white thing. And then, so as far as the discrimination, so you were asking the discrimination that Iranian Jews faced in Israel compared to what Jews in Europe are facing, or can you repeat that?
It was a two-part question.
Yeah.
To what extent does that discrimination against Mizrahi Jews exist in Israel today?
Okay.
And how would you compare that to discrimination that they face in the United States and Europe today?
Oh, that Mizrahi. Okay, I understand. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of Mizrahi Jewish activists in Israel who talk about the fact that there is still discrimination. This happens a lot in the educational sphere. The curriculum in Israeli schools speaks very little about Jewish history outside of Europe and the US. And there are some disadvantages. So like this has led actually to a lot of Jews of Mizrahi descent who grew up in Israel, who, their grandparents came to Israel, who are really reclaiming like their Arab roots. You have several bands that of Jews who sing in Arabic, for example. And so there's this idea that they're reclaiming this sort of past identity as Jews who lived in the Middle East and who shared cultures with Muslims or other non-Jews. And things are getting better, of course, because, there's a lot of like Jews, Ashkenazis married Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, you find this in my own family where one of my great uncles married a Jew of Romanian descent. So of course things have definitely gotten better, I think. And then as far as Mizrahi Jews in the US and Europe, I can speak to the US case because I'm a Mizrahi Jew who grew up in the US. I think, so my experience, especially within the educational sphere, has been one of a lot of silencing. I went to Solomon Schechter in the Chicago suburbs from kindergarten to 8th grade. And I was one of maybe, a dozen students who are not of Ashkenazi descent. And so also, I think people were just very surprised, first of all, to know that there were even Jews in Iran, let alone that Jews had been living there for 2,500 years. And there was just kind of this foreignness, we were treated, I was often treated as like a foreigner and as strange and weird, but I do think that it's getting better as well, or I hope at least. It wasn't all bad, obviously. I don't want to paint that picture, but there certainly is some discrimination within Jewish communities. But I've even noticed at Temple Emanu that there are, Rabbi Hayon, of course, is the rabbi, which is incredible. And there are Mizrahi congregants, which I love to see.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have another question, if it's all right.
Sure. Yes, please.
Particularly since no question is too stupid. I'm understanding that there is the cosmopolitan Jews of Tehran. Wasn't there some kind of community in another part that practiced a more ancient form of Judaism, kind of a stronghold? Is that true, or am I wrong on that?
So I'm not sure I would use the term ancient, but there were other Jewish communities, like prominent Jewish communities in other parts of Iran that persisted, into the post 1979 period. So you had huge Jewish communities in the city of Esfahan, also in Shiraz, and various other places. Most of these Jews ended up moving to Tehran, but there were Jewish communities living in very tiny villages where their practices, because they were cut off from other Jewish communities, may have been more ancient. I wouldn't use that term exactly, but they were in such remote areas, some of these Jewish communities, that their practice of Judaism would look very different from what the Jews in Tehran would be practicing, for example.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course, you're welcome. And I see that Paulette asks, are there Jews in Iran today? So yes, the estimates are difficult to come by, but what I found the most accurate would be around 10 to 15,000 still remain today, but they're kind of slowly trickling out, mostly to the US.
Excuse me. I thank you for answering that.
Sure.
I'm sorry, I had a tree service and I had to walk out. So what I wanted to ask you, and you already said it, but I actually, while you were talking, couldn't understand. In 1984, I wrote down some notes. You said life was becoming intolerable, not only for Jews, but non-Jews. So but was it a certain leader? I missed that. Was it a certain leader that came to power, or a government? Or
Sure,
why did it become intolerable in 1984?
That's great. I'm sorry I didn't offer that contextual information. Thanks for asking. So in 1979, there was the Islamic Revolution, which deposed the Shah, and it instituted Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious figure, as the supreme leader of Iran. And then Iran became an Islamic Republic, which what ended up happening, among many things, is that the educated first of all, there were a lot of these trials that in which Iranians who had been faithful to the Shah were executed. What starts to happen is things become a lot more religious. So women before this were able to wear, they were able to show their hair and wear, more westernized clothing. But then they started to institute laws in which women had to cover their hair. The educated started to be looked down upon as threats towards the new regime. And so there were all these things that were happening. And just like there was the Iran-Iraq wars, which of course, you're starting to conscript young men into the army. A lot of people wanted to avoid that too, because they didn't want their sons going into the army. So it was a number of factors, but basically what happens under the Islamic Revolution is that it just becomes, or the Islamic Republic, is that it just becomes a really tough place if you are upwardly mobile, educated, and want your children to live like a certain free lifestyle. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And there was something that resonated with me earlier, and I'm sure most of the people on this call know, but having been a docent at the Holocaust Museum for 10 years, I remember walking in and there was a picture of someone whose grandfather or father fought for Germany in the war, or not in the war, before the war. And the same thing, I have a picture of my grandfather and my great uncle in a German uniform before Hitler.
Right.
And so when you said the Jews, that was their country in Iran. They were same people can't understand. They were Berliners, or they were German, and they loved their country. It's very hard to leave. Would you say that most of the Jews, the majority, left in 79 when, what's his name? Ayatollah
Khomeini.
Khomeini was a horrible person. Is that when most of the Jews left in 79?
Well, I was talking about this a bit earlier, but it was more gradual. Not all of them left immediately, but by the late 1980s, a large majority had left. But even in the early 2000s, there were around 25,000 Jews in Iran, but that number has declined, and now it's only between 10 and 15,000. And yes, it's really interesting you bring that up about the idea of like being loyal to your country. And I think Germany is obviously a very extreme case because, I study the Holocaust too. Of course, I'm a Jewish historian, and what's so interesting about that is in retrospect, we ask, well, why didn't they leave? When in the 1930s, when there are all of these like signs that there's going to be some sort of genocide, but of course, a lot of the Jews, they had experienced so much, discrimination and persecution in Europe that they thought that it would just pass.
That's exactly right.
Right. And the thing about the Jews in Iran is that, especially in Iran became a Shi'i empire in the 1500s under the Safavid dynasty. And at that point, Jews started to experience a lot of discrimination and persecution. And this persisted, but it was not all the time, but it did happen over the centuries. And then it was more in the 20th century that it became very rare to actually have these very major incidences of discrimination. But that is all to say that I do not think we can compare, and I know you're not saying this, but I think it's important to make clear, we cannot compare the Iranian Jewish experiences of discrimination with what happened to Jews in Europe. I just really, you know, there was no Holocaust there. I just think it's really important to make that clear. Eleanor, you had
my grandmother having gone to the opera and all that, the handwriting was on the wall. It's just that they loved their life. And they thought that he was in power 12 years. They thought that it would just pass over. And that's exactly what we say, or were saying at the museum in some tours, that some people just thought it can't happen to me. They were well-established, very integrated citizens, and they just didn't leave until it was too late that they almost couldn't leave.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Paulette. Eleanor, you have a question?
Hi, thank you very much for this wonderful information. My understanding is that the American Jewish Iranian community, mostly centered in New York, is extremely tight knit. And I'm just wondering if over the years there's been more assimilation within the other members of the Jewish communities there.
Yeah, so the two major hubs of Iranian Jews in the US are Great Neck, New York, and Los Angeles. I think somebody actually brought this up in the chat, so I can address that. So actually what's interesting is that the Jews in New York, many of them come from a community of Jews in the city called Mashhad. And Mashhad is actually a very interesting exception in that in the mid 1800s, all of the Jews there were forced to convert to Islam, but they were crypto Jews. They continued to practice Judaism in secret until in the 1900s they were able to return back to Judaism. So a lot of those Jews actually ended up moving to Great Neck, and they very much are a tight-knit community, is my understanding. I don't have relatives there. I have relatives in LA, so I could speak more to that. And it is an area of interest that I want to work on more as I move forward in my scholarship. So I think like with the generations, of course, you know, people are assimilating more and more, but you can talk about this about any like minority community. I think in a lot of ways, if there's like a big group of you, then you're able to marry among one another. You know, you have like certain cultural organizations that for me didn't exist in Chicago, pardon me, because there wasn't a big Iranian Jewish community. So there really is a type of insularity, I would say, among the Iranian Jews in New York and LA that I didn't experience because I wasn't brought up in an Iranian milieu. Thank you. And these are all great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Farah. Thank you so much for being here with us today. This has been a fascinating talk, and we so appreciate your taking the time to be here with us. Anna, I see you put it in the chat. Do you want to say a few words about coming events? I will put in, those of you who came on early heard me saying that our Shirley Barish Memorial Israel Experience trip is departing this Monday. If you want to follow the adventures of our teams, please check out our Facebook page, and I will look forward to seeing all of you in July when we return. For now, I'll turn it over to Anna.
Well, actually, quickly, Anna, sorry, I want to just, again, thank you all for attending and your great questions. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach me. I will put my email in the chat. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was so interesting. Yeah. And I did put it in the chat, but Friday, June 24th, if people are in town, we're having dinner, community Shabbat dinner following services, which is just a great way to see each other, have dinner together, meet new people, and we hope you'll all join us.
Is this all in the newsletter that we get in the mail?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.